Well, I think, should we get started? Everyone, I think we should. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Catherine Howarth, Chief Executive of Share Action, and it's my great pleasure to moderate and chair this final session of the WDI conference, although we have one more special treat, which is the company awards ceremony, which is coming up after a short break following this session. What we're going to cover in the session over the next hour is a conversation about reporting on the S of ESG, and particularly focusing in obviously on workforce reporting. And we're going to look at and discuss together some of the evolution of corporate reporting and transparency as it relates to the workforce, identifying and talking through the quite complex array of mandatory and voluntary reporting frameworks. And we want to dig into some of the key concepts that are driving thinking in this space, particularly the double materiality concept that the European Commission has done so much to popularize and bring to life. And we strongly kind of at Share Action endorse that thinking, just because it puts rights holders or workers right at the center of the picture. So I'm really pleased. We have a brilliant panel of bringing different perspectives. I will introduce them in a moment, but just to kind of give a flavor, we've got policymakers, investors, sort of experts on human rights, and last but not least, crucially, company representatives who are really involved in reporting to investors and publicly, bringing their perspective. Both the companies are disclosures to the WDI, so we're very happy with that, obviously. Well, the first thing we're going to do, which I'm delighted about, is have a sort of short keynote video from Commissioner McGuinness from the European Commission, giving a bit of a context on the sustainable finance agenda at EU level, and helping us to lead into this discussion around the S of ESG within the context of sustainable finance. So let's have Commissioner McGuinness remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to address the Workforce Disclosure Initiative's annual conference. Today, I'll provide you with a short update on sustainable finance in the European Union, in particular on social priorities. Two developments have dramatically changed the finance landscape over the past year. First is the European Green Deal, which is a top priority for the Commission. The European Union is determined to achieve climate neutrality by 2050 and reduce emissions with more ambition by 2030. Second is, of course, the COVID-19 crisis, which has destabilized our economies and our societies, not to mention our healthcare systems. There are higher expectations that companies and the financial system should deliver on social objectives. Finance has a vital role to play in supporting the transformation towards a more sustainable society. Policymakers need to support finance to make this transformation. And in the European Union, we're playing a leading role. In the past year, we put in place three important pieces of legislation on sustainable finance. First is the taxonomy regulation. The European Union's taxonomy is one of the world's first green lists for economic activities that make a substantial positive impact on climate and the environment. Second is our disclosure regulation. Financial market participants must disclose to investors how they integrate sustainability issues in their products and processes. The three central parts of sustainability are ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance. The S includes social issues such as child protection or equal working conditions. Third and finally is the climate benchmark regulation. We're providing markets with powerful new tools to foster transparency and improve the integrity of the growing market for sustainable financial products. We also want to improve sustainability reporting. Our non-financial reporting directive, adopted in 2014, already requires large companies to publish information on the policies they implement on sustainability issues. An updated non-financial reporting directive will be proposed in the coming months to strengthen ESG disclosures by corporates. We want to support much better reporting on the full range of ESG issues, including workforce-related matters. To step up our ambition, the Commission is preparing a renewed sustainable finance strategy for early 2021. And this renewed strategy will empower companies to move away from unsustainable activities and transition to sustainable activities. We want to mainstream the treatment of climate and environmental risks in the financial system. It will explore new areas to mainstream sustainability in the financial and corporate sectors in Europe and globally. Social issues will be a key part of our strategy. I see two areas that we could explore in particular. First, we are considering whether a social taxonomy would be appropriate. The existing EU taxonomy regulation focuses on environmental sustainability, starting with climate. It also requires compliance with minimum social safeguards for any economic activity considered environmentally sustainable. In the Commission, we have an expert group, the Platform on Sustainable Finance, to provide us with advice in this area. We've asked them to look into extending the taxonomy to cover other sustainability issues, including social objectives. The Commission is also active in the area of social bonds. Only recently, the EU issued social bonds for the SURE programme, a temporary package to help EU countries facing sudden increases in public spending to maintain employment. These social bonds are based on a market standard for social bonds containing high-level recommendations for issuers of such bonds. The Commission is exploring further action, in particular whether to develop an official EU social bond standard. It's been a very difficult year for all of us, including for business. The pandemic has provided us with a demonstration of the impact of non-financial risks on companies, their employees, their activities, and their supply chains. It is a lesson for business and regulators, and we should learn from it. The European Union is proud to be a leader on sustainable finance, and we're considering further how we can incorporate social issues into that agenda. We want to work together to make sure that financial flows are redirected to sustainability. Thank you.
Right, get everybody back together. Very helpful remarks from Commissioner McGuinness, setting out the stall in terms of what the Commission is doing in the area of sustainable finance, including in the area of sustainability reporting, and a very honest assessment of her that environmental issues have been sort of the leading edge, but there is, it would seem, good political will, particularly post-pandemic, to ensure that the Commission is also setting strong standards for social reporting on a wide range of issues, but critically the workforce from the point of view of our conversations today. So a great kind of lead off into the conversation we're going to have in the next few minutes. I'm just going to introduce the various people that you can hopefully see up on the screen. Really delighted that Caroline Rees, the president of Shift, is with us today. Also, Rachel Calburn-Walden, who's the Global Director of Human Rights Stewardship at Unilever, a company that's been doing some very dynamic things in this space. Sarah Tassai, who's the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility at Vinci, a major French company that, again, has done some really innovative things and is also taking reporting very seriously. Then Matthias Nahr, who's the Global Head of Engagement at the Ethos pool of institutional investors based in Switzerland, representing a broad cross-section of Swiss investors, but particularly pension schemes. And Matthias will talk us through some of the work he's been doing to engage with companies on workforce issues. And then last but not least, Alan Deckers, who is the Head of Unit for Corporate Reporting Audit Credit Rating Agencies for FISMA, the Financial Services Directorate of the European Commission. And Alan has been deeply involved in thinking about the evolution of these issues over quite some years, and very much looking forward to getting his perspective. Alan, are you still there? You've disappeared from my screen. Okay, well, hopefully Alan will reply and I haven't scared him off. So let's just dig in with some kind of almost introductory perspectives on the challenges and realities of reporting on the workforce. And I'd like just to, if I may, start with Caroline Rees, just to kind of give her perspective from Shift on, what is sustainability reporting as it relates to the workforce, and why does it matter so much?
Yeah, thanks so much, Catherine. It's great to be with you today. Well, I guess obviously, reporting at its root is a critical form of accountability, isn't it? And originally thinking primarily about accountability to the providers of capital for how that capital is being used productively. But of course, companies can affect many actors other than shareholders alone, and indeed do so in the ways that they conduct themselves. They affect also many people, their workforce, of course, front and center, but into supply chains and communities and so forth, as well as the environment. And so that accountability has a wider purview, if you will, wider relevance to other stakeholders. And that, of course, is what we're looking at here, and why, you referred to that double materiality concept that the European Commission has been so important in advancing in reporting, that brings not just the lens of financial materiality, but also what we might call impact materiality. And that's, I think, the critical piece here. In other words, we're saying that certain things matter not just to the extent that they help or hinder a company in making money, but they matter for broader societal reasons. And that's where I think there's a big connection through then to standards of conduct. And of course, in this space of how companies affect people, we do have a global standard of conduct, which is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, that set out what the reasonable expectations of business are in this regard. And again, put that spotlight on putting the focus of attention on where the greatest risks to people lie, right? So not just where they converge with risk to the business, although they very often do, but starting with where are the greatest risks to people. And when we look at the workforce, then that really, I think, focuses the lens in on particular segments of the workforce. And we see, the necessity of focusing in on where are the lowest paid workers, where are those with the least predictable hours and therefore the least clarity of whether they can put food on the table next week, next month for their families, where are those who don't have access to benefits because of the nature of their working relationship with an employer or employers, or who face other insecurities around those issues in the direct workforce, but in these other forms, perhaps of gig economy role and so forth, these other roles we see expanding these days rather than contracting. And I think that's where the WDI disclosures come in and become so important to helping us gain visibility into what is the workforce composition, who has access to collective bargaining and can bring voice into wage negotiations, what are the experiences of women in the workforce, ethnic minorities in the workforce, and so forth. It's telling, I think, that it's so common for companies rightly to talk about their workforce as an asset. People are our greatest asset, right? It's almost cliche, yet it's so true. And yet when we come to management accounting and management decision making, of course, actually they're primarily treated as a cost. And so paying people more increases costs and starts to imply a trade-off with the interests of shareholders, rather than being seen as an investment in an asset that actually protects and indeed increases the potential future returns to shareholders. And so that conundrum, we need to break that apart. And if we recognize the workforce as an asset, we need to find ways to reflect that appropriately in decision making and understand the value of investment. And I think that's what COVID has also really brought out in stark relief, that not just in rhetoric is the workforce an asset, but when the chips are down, when the times are times of crisis, the vulnerabilities that are imposed on workers reflect back as vulnerabilities to the business, right? The workforce isn't there, or is having to work when people are sick, working those extra hours, putting the extra strain on when they don't have the security of working position to do that, and those vulnerabilities coming back, loss of resilience in the supply chain, in the workforce, and so forth. So at a time of pandemic, the realities come through, but I think the critical thing in reporting is that not just in a time of crisis, we need to see the focus of reporting talking about how those who are most vulnerable in the workforce are being treated, how their situation is being improved, how their human rights are being respected.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for that fantastic overview. I mean, interestingly, we've had an incredibly interesting live example of the costs of poor workforce practices influencing a company's bottom line with the very high-profile IPO earlier today of Deliveroo. It's been a major flop, and I think that's very much down to the fact that the company and investors, investors have been highlighting that they're really deeply troubled by the business model as far as looking after the workforce is concerned. So it's just been very, very interesting on the day of the WDI conference to have such a vivid example of how these things can indeed come together. And you see that alignment, which is not always there, as you say. Well, look, let's dive into the experience of both Rachel and Sarah in their companies. And I just like you, Rachel, to perhaps give a little sense of, the journey that Unilever has gone on in terms of sustainability reporting, and what are the kind of challenges, but also the kind of plus points and upsides of making the effort to report more rather than less. And again, to commend you for being a WDI reporting company. We're going to have got two Allens. It's interesting experience. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks very much, Catherine, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm always very humble when I'm on panels like this. As any multinational company with supply chains the size of Unilever, we still have much work to do, and we still have many issues to resolve. So it's always with humility and being humble that I, take part in these discussions. But reporting, as you say, is very important to Unilever. Transparency is very important. As our CEO has said, the era of radical transparency is upon us, and we welcome it. It's very much about understanding, tracing our supply chain so that we can work with others to address issues, and then to report on both our progress but also some of our challenges, and very much obviously in line with the UNGPs, as Caroline has said. And that was very much the motivation of our first human rights report back in 2015, which we published, in the spirit of wanting to encourage others to report, to bring others with us on the journey, and to be upfront about some of those remaining challenges. And the report aligned with the UNGP reporting framework. I think what's really good when it comes to reporting is, in addition to the external result, it's those internal discussions and dialogues that you have. So discussing internally on a cross-functional basis to actually understand, what data do we have? And often companies have more data than they actually think they may have, and then, or they may have data, but they just don't make it public. So you're on one hand discussing data, on the other hand, you're actually discussing some of the ongoing issues to be resolved within global supply chains. So I think that's really important. It also gives you a benchmark to continue to make progress. I think certainly from a voluntary initiative perspective, there's always a bit of healthy competition amongst companies, particularly consumer-facing companies. So that's always good. And it continues to drive good practice and to learn from others, which I think is absolutely critical. I mean, in terms of the ESG and the S, because that's my area, I mean, fundamentally, this is about really bringing to life that financial data of companies by actually talking about, as Caroline said, the people themselves who are doing the doing. And that is absolutely critical. And I'm really pleased that there is an increased focus by investors on that ESG. And I remember when we were first talking to a group of investors about our first human rights report, they saw that very much as, risk mitigation. Being transparent, understanding the kind of issues is something that they were pleased about and saw as a helpful addition. So I think that's all really positive. I think just alignment is critical, and I think we're probably going to come on to that later. And also reporting with a purpose, so meaningful reporting as well, so it doesn't just become a tick boxing exercise. And I think finally, our other learning is you do want to make certain that the reporting burden is not so much that actually you're not able to do all the work on the ground, which of course is the rightful expectation of our stakeholders.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a really great overview. And I would love to congratulate Unilever on the commitment it's made to global living wage standards. I think setting real pace in the UK listed sector, but as a global company that will have impact all across the world. Sarah, could you give us your perspective at Vinci on both the reporting, the challenges around that internally? Perhaps Rachel's talked about some of those, but also why it makes sense, given that you're in an industry where there are risks and hazards around human rights issues, to kind of be more rather than less transparent.
Yes, for us it was the second time, but in between we didn't do the reporting. So we did 1 year and then we stopped, and then the second this year. So I think that what is very interesting too in this case, it's a very comprehensive approach of social issue. It's not only human rights, it's not only diversity, and it's tackling all the issue related to workforce, which is quite unusual. Not all the framework are doing this. And obviously, you shift this idea from the risk on the company to the risk on the people, which is not so usual and not so frequent in the business community globally, within companies or at investor levels. So this is a big shift internally to make them understand that what we are seeking is the impact we have on others, and in the first place, our employees. So this is a big step, I think, and an important one. And I think that today there is a lot of issues that are growing on the S, but there is a major focus on the E of ESG, obviously, because there is a climate urgency. But we have to be careful at the same time that this environmental topic they don't squeeze all the others. They can be, some tendency. And so I think really it's important that we always give emphasis on these topics. And this type of reporting, I think it's important too, because it gives about practices. It's not only risk mitigation, but it gives some lights on what are the practices, the indicators to the investors community as well. And sometimes on these topics, you can hide on cultural approach. It's different in this country on these topics, or the question of the wages, minimum wages, living wages. So there can be lots of discussion internally or at local level about what is the good framework and what we should tackle. So to follow indicators, to have some benchmark, it's very important too.
Thank you, Sarah. I mean, I want to thank you for kind of capturing the design components of the WDI framework, which is absolutely for investors, but taking this kind of rights holders perspective right at the core, and being really committed to trying to kind of give some tangibility to the double materiality. So I'm glad it's been a good experience, and you're back in the fold as a WDI disclosure after a year off. So I hope you'll stay with us next year. So I'm gonna now just bring in the investor perspective from Matthias. Matthias, I mean, ethos and the name of your organization kind of gives it away. You do have an ethical commitment as an organization, which is not present for all investors. And I just want to give, capture from you a bit of kind of why workforce issues matter to you as an investment organization, and what you're doing with the data that you receive through the WDI, and how that's useful in the engagements you have with companies.
Yes, thank you very much, Catherine. And I think it's correct to say that ethos were maybe a little bit a different animal compared to some other investors, because social issues have been close to our heart for a very long time. And also it's also historically so, because many of our pension funds are associated with unions. So of course there's a natural overlap. But I think when I just look more broadly at the investor community, and also at our work through ShareAction, through ICCR, through the PRI, through all these networks, I think it's clear, and I agree with Sarah, that historically, as social issues have been a little bit hidden. Clearly, it all started with corporate governance, and now since a few years, climate change / environmental issues are really at the forefront. But I think over the last 12 months, this has really changed a lot. Also, not just from, let's say, dark green or dark social investors, but really also in the mainstream. And I think it's mainly in my view, for 4 reasons. I think investors have now with COVID really realized that they actually have an edge if they look at these things, because employers are important. And I think that's maybe, as Caroline said, it has been or it is a little bit of a cliche, but it's true. It's a true cliche. So I think that's one thing, this realization. And then the second thing I've seen is there's also crossover of this issue into social. So even on the environmental side, now when we talk about transition and climate plans, there's always this notion of achieving a just transition. So I think that's a very important aspect, because it links for the first time really closely these 2 issues. I think that's important. And then thirdly, of course, regulation. I think it's like a little bit like a tsunami for investors as well as for companies. In Germany, we now have a Lieferkettengesetz, which is quite, I mean, it's not as tough as it maybe should have been, but it's still quite a milestone. Here in Switzerland, we do have upcoming regulation which touches child labor and social issues. And the UNGPs, which are becoming always more important. So I think that's really important. And then, of course, the last thing, and that for me really hit the nail on its head, is the COVID situation, of course. And there, I think it has just been a catalyst for all these things to happen a lot quicker. And one thing which I really think has been crucial is this idea of worker voice, or how you protect the frontline workers, because there really there has been a difference, or let's say a discrepancy between the communication of the companies and what actually happened. So I think that's just, it's becoming a really important topic. I'm fascinated by the Amazon case particularly. We have seen a lot of protests around warehouses in France, in Italy, where unions are historically quite strong. And of course, then Amazon has been very confrontational. We're seeing now what is going on at the Bessemer facility, which for me is quite astounding. There's a broad investor coalition that is actually pushing Amazon to do more. Remains to be seen if they listen. But there, for the first time, really having a full agreement between a large investor community and let's say the political side, or at least parts of the political side. So I think this is really a catalyst, and I think investors are active. And it's important because these are big names in the investment portfolios of the pension funds, because they mainly invest in a passive way, and Amazon is in all these portfolios. So I think that's just a really encouraging development. And then, of course, the challenge for this to make it institutionalized and to really establish it is to have data, and that's where I really see the big role of the Workforce Disclosure Initiative, is to have this access to comparable, to standardized data on all these topics: diversity, contingent workers, worker voice, structure of supply chain, etc. That's for me really what is still needed, and there's a big gap. But I'm happy to be involved with this initiative, and I think it's more timely now than ever to push for this.
Thank you, Matthias. It's wonderful to have you involved in the WDI as one of the committed investors involved. And you cited Amazon. Of course, Amazon has not disclosed to the WDI this year, and we'll come on in a minute to the pitfalls and challenges of a voluntary approach, which I think WDI exemplifies what is possible and is a very sophisticated tool. But of course, it depends on companies choosing, as the two companies on this panel, who are very enlightened companies, have done, to provide disclosures. But there's plenty of companies with issues that have not, which is a good segue into bringing Alan into the conversation. Alan, thank you so much for being on the panel. It's great to get your perspective. And I'm full of admiration for what the EU has been doing in the last several years, partly because Share Action does a great deal in the climate and environmental space. But of course, we are eager for the Commission to do more and continue to be really ambitious in the sort of S of ESG space as well. And very encouraged by Commissioner McGuinness's words on that. But can you flesh that out a little bit more and give your perspective both on where we've got to and where we're heading in terms of policy around this?
Yes, thank you very much, Catherine, and hello to everybody. Pleasure to be with you. The first thing I perhaps should say is that, of course, while we fully acknowledge the need to do more on the S part of the ESG spectrum, there are already some things that the EU has done. We've had some disclosure requirements on diversity policies, for example, for boards in particular. The Commission earlier this month, if I remember correctly, I think it was the 4th of March, adopted a proposal on pay transparency and pay equality, which also contains important measures on transparency related to the gender pay gap, for example, and things like that. Having said all of that, we fully acknowledge that there's still a lot more work to do. Commissioner McGuinness already mentioned some of the areas in which the Commission is considering to do further work. In particular, perhaps worth highlighting the review clause that's in the taxonomy regulation that will lead to at some stage an assessment of whether that taxonomy should be extended to social criteria. Perhaps this is one difference I'd like to highlight with the approach we're taking with the revision of the non-financial reporting directive. In the taxonomy, as everybody knows, we've started with climate, we then move on to other environmental consideration, and then there's this review clause for social issues. By contrast, for the non-financial reporting directive, we're aiming to tackle the full spectrum of ESG issues, including the S, right from the get-go. And that is something that's already reflected in the report that the EFRAG Task Force on Sustainability Reporting Standards submitted to the Commission a few weeks ago, and you will see in that report that the S dimension is fully taken into consideration and would be part of the work of the standard setter right from the get-go, if indeed the decision in the end is made to develop European sustainability reporting standards, which is something which I think is very likely. But of course, it is a decision which has to be confirmed by the College of Commissioners. So that's one important difference I want to make between the approach we've taken for the taxonomy and the approach we're taking for the NFRD. The other point, which perhaps is worth highlighting, is the one you've already mentioned earlier, Catherine, about the double materiality perspective. Again, we've been very insistent that any future standards that we use in Europe must fully reflect the double materiality perspective. So impacts on people and on the environment must be fully factored in. We think this is important not only for accountability reasons, because that is it's really only if companies publish information about these issues, that about their impacts on people and the environment, that they can really be held accountable. But even if you look at it from a purely capital markets perspective, given the increasing importance of impact investment, it's really essential that we have good information about the impacts of companies on people and the environment, because otherwise, how do we know whether the claims that are being made in these impact investment products are really correct or not? And we often talk about greenwashing. in the environmental space. I don't know what the equivalent would be in the social space, whether it's people washing or whatever it may be, but clearly that is something we want to avoid.
People washing, when I think about my children, is something we don't want to avoid, but yes, do take your point, absolutely. So and perhaps if I could just capture, Alan, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which is a regulation falling on investors, which we think Share Action is really pioneering insofar as we know, some of the first regulation anywhere to encourage investors to report their impacts. And I know that even in the environmental space, investors have been troubled by and complaining about the fact that there isn't enough data to enable them to do that, which I think, in part, investors could actually be much more active in pushing companies to disclose the information that they're going to need using the shareholder rights that they have in order to meet their obligations under the SFRD. There we go. That's what I was talking about. But on the S side, it's going to be even more challenging, arguably. So I'm just like you to reflect on some of the kind of challenges and realities of setting very far-sighted regulation, but which does depend on data, which I think the WDI speaks to that, because in trying to present a framework that's really practical and usable by both investors and companies.
No, absolutely. We fully agree with that. And that is one of the reasons why we are currently under a great deal of pressure to accelerate the work related to the revision of the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, and also the development of potential sustainability reporting standards in Europe. And it's one of the reasons also why we think we will probably need to work in parallel if the College of Commissioners decides that we will proceed with the development of the EU sustainability reporting standards, why we think we will need to work on that in parallel with the legislative negotiations, because otherwise it will take a very long time to develop standards, and we do not have that time, given the implementation timetable for the SFDR that you mentioned. Clearly, investors are in urgent need of getting better information, and we hope that the revised NFRD will provide the tool that will allow them to give to obtain that better information. Clearly, you're right. Investors by themselves can do more. The risk, if of course, is that there is a coordination problem. If you leave this to a purely investor-driven or voluntary model, and then that falls onto the back of the preparers, the companies that have to report, where you have one large investor asking them to report according to SASB, another one asking them to report according to GRI, and so on, which is not a comfortable position to be in from a preparer point of view, I think. And that is perhaps something that we can sidestep, a problem that we can sidestep if we can forge a consensus. And of course, if standards are mandatory, it's not just a question of consensus, it's a question of obligation to use a common set of standards in Europe.
Yeah, well, let's get have the companies on the panel respond to that point in a moment. Really glad you raised it. But in the meantime, Caroline, I'd just like you to dig into some of the virtues of voluntary frameworks as well. I mean, they do help kind of set the outer edge in terms of standards and a sort of imaginative approach as to what might be possible ultimately in future for a more mandatory approach. So can you just speak to some of the dynamics? Because of course there is also this problem of multiple voluntary standards that are different and make different demands. That's the downside.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, as you say, that the arena of voluntary standards has enabled some testing and trialing and learning and building, and so there's an opportunity to leverage those years of experience as we turn that corner now, hopefully with the new standards etc. in Europe into a more mandatory framework. And we need to learn those lessons, the good and the bad, I think is critical, because there are both out there in what we've seen. When we, in our work in developing the UN Guiding Principles reporting framework with Mazar, we're looking at this, what we actually saw at the beginning in this sort of social or people-related arena was that a lot of reporting had become quite divorced from management. It goes back to what Rachel said, right? You need this to be meaningful, right? Rachel talked about those internal conversations that it needs to drive. And what we were seeing was there were quite a few numbers that were being measured just for the reporting frameworks that were divorced from management because they didn't help the management and they didn't reflect good management. They were just numbers that, it had been estimated, it would be good to know, or it would be easy to measure. And so in the reporting framework, we actually went right back to basics and we said, let's drop metrics for now and let's go back to looking at what are the questions to which a company should have answers internally, whether or not it decides to disclose the answers externally, just questions to which it needs to have the answers if it's to understand and effectively manage impacts on people. So that was a framework just made up of questions, but questions that don't enable tick box answers, that aren't yes, no, that require conversation and discovery and so forth. And that's, I think, why we've seen the popularity of that, because it simply started to make sense again. And then it's like 2 or 3 years ago, we came back in our work, say, okay, now let's go back to looking at what makes for good indicators, what makes for good metrics that can support meaningful narrative. And I think these are the kinds of learnings that we need to embed as we go forward. We do see in this arena still some metrics and some indicators that I think have been determined more by the idea that we need to have a number on everything, or that everything needs to be comparable. Now, it's absolutely right. Matthias was so right to highlight the value of comparability, but sometimes we think something is comparable that actually isn't comparable, right? It's to take the idea of the proportion of a supply chain with a significant risk of forced labor. Gosh, that sounds measurable and it sounds comparable, but it's really almost impossible to measure in any meaningful way. And it's not comparable because so much depends on the context in order to draw any conclusion about the performance of the company in relation to that issue. So we need to draw back from some indicators that have grown prevalent and start to filter them in terms of what is really giving the users of information valuable insight and is connected to the effective management of the issues. And I think, that's the opportunity in many ways that the Commission, or in the future standard setter in its role, has, and I was very pleased to see that the task force itself highlighted the need to look at indicators, including existing indicators, with that kind of a quality filter, so as not just to assume that what's out there is good. But what I will do there, Catherine, is then connect that back actually to some of your metrics in the WDI and really the value that they do bring, because I think they're a good counterpoint to that. And I think we see, when you look at the percentage of a workforce that's in forms of contingent labor, when we look at the percentage of a workforce that has collective bargaining, access to collective bargaining, those are both indicators of actual outcomes for people and indicators of the mindset of a company and whether a company is really thinking seriously about how its decisions, and maybe its cost-cutting decisions, affect the welfare of people and how it structures its organization. So I think we've got some great examples in WDI of good indicators, and we need to learn the lessons as we turn that corner from the voluntary into the mandatory.
Thank you so much for capturing this really tricky tension between achieving the standardization that allows these sort of social factors to really be integrated into investment decision making, and then at the same time the need to be quite subtle about what's included and to keep hunting for and experimenting until we find the right metrics that are genuinely meaningful. And I hope that WDI can play a role in being quite a sophisticated tool, but by no means one that doesn't anticipate and hope that these kind of measures will become mandatory in time for companies to report, and that investors will therefore be able to see the relevant metrics from a much wider range of companies over time. Let me turn quickly to both of the two companies about your experience of kind of navigating these different regimes and how you choose which reporting frameworks to report using, and also some of the differences in different jurisdictions across the world where you may be a subject to quite different reporting regimes or requirements and demands. Sarah, can you give us a bit of perspective on how you navigate as a global company the different regimes in different parts of the world?
So even in France, we have many regimes that we have to handle with. So France is very advanced when it comes to legislation. So I think we are we have some advance on these topics. We have to comply. Being a French-based company, we have to comply with French regulation, obviously, and European one. So then when it comes to, and we really try to make it the more comprehensive so that they can answer maybe to modern slavery as well and to the French duty of vigilance law. Even there are some different expectations sometimes of the stakeholders. How do we choose? We are really listening to the expectation of the different stakeholders, so civil society, investors, sometimes the clients, or the country where we are. We have the largest operation. So that's how we decide. We cannot answer to everything. It's not possible. So we have to choose. And we have to have also, we have lots of discussion internally on these topics, because sometimes the financial division says it's too much in your annual report. You have to choose. We have to cut. And really, this is a very strong discussion we have with financial divisions, and because they want something really small, much smaller, and not be comprehensive. And on the other side, that's why we decided to answer, for example, to WDI, because it's very comprehensive on social topics, and it addresses a specific stakeholder, which are investors. So we have to choose. It's a discussion, it's an ongoing discussion. Maybe 1 year we will answer to one, and now we invested in that direction, we are going to follow it. And we are leaving aside sometimes other volunteer initiatives, because there is not any use anymore, and it's not accurate anymore. Maybe it's too global now. Everyone is looking for very specific things on the environmental topics and the social one as well. So that's how we handle this topic, which is not so easy. It's a moving one.
I feel for you. Anyway, Rachel, can you speak to the same sort of set of issues that, as you perceive them in Unilever?
I mean, very similar to what Sarah said. I mean, you do have to make choices. Obviously, you can't report using every framework. We do have finite resources, no matter how big the company is. And as I said, we don't want to spend all our time reporting. So we make those choices based on reputation and credibility of who is asking us to report from a voluntary perspective. And that's why that alignment is absolutely critical. And, we are seeing more alignment, which is good. So WBA being a really good example of that. And of course, WDI, which, as we've said, is becoming an increasingly big player in this space, which is fantastic. So alignment critical in terms of, how do we navigate, various jurisdictional, a lot of the work in terms of, Unilever's policy, position, process is at a global level. So it will be predominantly that global information, whether that's, UK Modern Slavery Act or reporting requirements such as that. So alignment is the message, because then you're going to get much more, you are going to get that more meaningful, impactful reporting. I do think it's really interesting also when you're looking at different reporting requirements, just that understanding that for a company that has 500 suppliers, how they report is going to be very different to a company that has 5,000, or in the case of Unilever, more than 50,000 suppliers. And so actually that realistic expectation in terms of what to report and how to report is critical. I think the other just final point from my perspective is just that impact discussion is so important. And we do need to, we are getting better. I mean, we as an industry, but there is still a long way to go to meaningfully report on impact, and to Caroline's points, to move beyond number of non-conformances and number of workers trained to actually what that looks like on the ground. And of course, social is so far behind environmental. And I think it would be really good to really focus on this, and also to get alignment within impact reporting as well, not just reporting itself, but actually how companies are reporting on their impact. That alignment is absolutely critical too.
Come off mute. Thank you so much, Rachel, for those insights. I am off mute. Good. Matthias, I just wanted to, before we get into the questions, there's a number of questions that come in from people in the audience, which I'm keen to get into. But just some of your experience of engaging with companies about workforce issues, how relative to the conversations and dialogue that you have with companies on environmental themes, what's the experience, and how open do you find companies to conversations about their management of people, their treatment of people, and both the risks and impacts that have been referred to?
Yeah, I think it's definitely improving. We have seen that many of the companies that we talk to are more open to talk about social issues. Maybe 5 years ago, they were a little bit less open to do so, and also mainly related to the lack of their own understanding and their own access to data. But I think this has improved. And again, as I said in my previous remark, I think COVID-19 has been really like a catalyst for this, and I think it will not go back to the way before it was COVID-19. What we see sometimes as a little challenge when we talk to companies is in terms of how they frame it, because every company tells us, yes, we know companies are the most important assets that we have. We will take care of our workers, but I think it's now really crucial. And this is the responsibility of the investors. And I think some of the investors could maybe do more here, is to really check these claims. Are these claims serious? Does the company really take care of the workers? We have seen this, for example, in the discussion in the US around paid sick leave, which was for me very disappointing, some of the reactions we have seen from some companies. So I think here it's now really the responsibility of investors to look very closely. Okay, are these claims of taking care of our workers, taking care of our supply chains, are they lived up to in the reality? And that's why it goes back to the Workforce Disclosure Initiative, because it gives us investors a tool to do this, to check these claims quite easily, because again, many investors are passively invested, have a large number of companies in their portfolios, and need to have access to comparable, easy to use data. So I think it's now really also with us investors to check these claims.
Thank you, Matthias. And let's dig into some of the questions that have come up. There's an excellent question on the link between climate change and human rights, and the need for companies to kind of recognize the connections between E&S and acknowledge that it's problematic, although very common, for these themes to be seen in isolation. And that is perhaps a function of the fact that through reporting frameworks, we put things in little boxes. But anyway, can I just ask maybe Alan to comment on any perspective you've got on that, and then others on the panel as well.
Thank you. I hope you can still hear and see me, because I had to switch my phone. I was disconnected again from my laptop. Yeah, I mean, all of these things are interconnected, and it's convenient to pigeonhole them so that we can, it simplifies the thinking. But of course, we have to be careful that doesn't mean that we lose touch with the complexity of how things actually occur in the world. And you mentioned the link between climate change and human rights. Clearly, climate change, to the extent that it's likely to increasingly lead to social and political upheaval, is quite clearly likely to have an impact on respect for human rights too. Now, what are the implications of that in terms of reporting? Do we need to really draw out all those links in the reporting standards? Something to be looked at. I'd hesitate to venture anything that would approach or that would seem to be like a definitive reply on that. Maybe something for the future standard setter to look at. But I think what's important is that we cover the whole spectrum, because it's only if we cover the whole spectrum that we can really afterwards make those links, if indeed they exist. And so what we need to make sure is that we don't sort of forge ahead on climate reporting, even if climate reporting is technically somewhat more mature than other areas, and therefore is probably going to move quite quickly. And I suspect that is also one of the reasons why the IFRS Foundation is choosing to focus on that topic, among other reasons. But we shouldn't. That should not mean that all the other areas sort of are left behind. And so we need to move. We need to make progress across the broad front.
Absolutely. Caroline, just really briefly, because we're beginning to get short of time now, your perspectives on these linkages and the need to join the dots.
Yeah, I think there often is that linkage between sort of the effects of climate change falling disproportionately on those who are most vulnerable, who have least sort of ability to realise their human rights. But I think there's a reverse relationship as well that's important, right? People who are in who are not enjoying their human rights, that inequality and that flows from that reality also affects our ability to tackle climate change. There was a wonderful piece of work done by Paul Hawken some years back looking at practical ways in which companies could contribute to drawing down CO2 from the environment. And I think either number 5 or number 6 in the list of 100 practical ways was getting more girls into education, right? The primary way of limiting population in the future, and also of better stewardship of land and farming. But when companies are looking at child labour in their supply chains, I'm not sure any of them are making the connection to the extent to which they can get more girls out of child labour in cocoa, in sugar, in many other places, apparel where those girls are working, often in forms of forced labour. It actually has a relationship onwards into climate change. If you respect the rights of indigenous peoples to enable them to be stewards of the forest, you can do a better job at limiting deforestation. And equally, if you are not recognizing that smallholder farmers often struggle to make the income to put food on the table, you don't understand how to tackle the incentives to encourage them not to be part of deforestation. So there are relationships in both directions on this, and inequality and lack of human rights and respect for human rights also limits our ability to tackle climate change.
Yeah, I think that's such a wonderful example that tackling child labour is, of course, a brilliant climate related intervention. A lovely example. Thank you so much for that, Caroline. We're kind of coming to the end of our time together. It's been a really rich and full discussion. Thank you so much, everybody. And I want to just say a few quick words of thanks to all the people in the audience, investors who are part of the Workforce Disclosure Initiative Coalition that have, chipping in to contribute to the running costs of WDI. Pulling all this data together, analysing all this data, designing a really credible questionnaire that really does try, as Caroline's described, get to the really significant issues that need to be reported. This all takes resource, and we're most grateful to the pioneering investors that are part of the WDI coalition. We hope and encourage many other investors across the world to join the WDI coalition, contribute and get the benefit of some hugely rich reporting that is coming out of the corporate sector, but also to push more companies to disclose. So I want to also thank the companies that have participated in the WDI this year. The data was released today. A big day in the WDI calendar. It's a lot of work, but it's also very rewarding to report to the WDI. So thank you to all those companies, and I'm sure that your efforts will be and are really recognized by the investment community and more broadly other stakeholders as well. And I also just want to thank everyone in the WDI staff team who've done so much over the last year to make today's data release possible, but also to put a lot of effort into a fantastic conference today. So thank you to colleagues in the WDI team. And finally, yeah, just to thank everyone on this panel for making for a really excellent conversation at the end of the day. We have a half-hour break now, followed by the inaugural WDI Awards ceremony, recognizing some of the real innovations and efforts made by companies in this year's reporting. So that will be in half an hour, and now I'm going to let everybody go off and have a tea break, and just to thank everyone again for participating in a wonderful event today. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.